At our family dinner, my daughter-in-law leaned close, her voice soft as silk and twice as cutting. "I'm carrying your husband's child," she whispered. I smiled, took a slow breath, and told her not to worry. Weeks later, I handed her something far worse than fear. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me through the end, and let me know where you're watching from. I want to know how far truth can travel." The roast had just come out of the oven when they pulled into the drive. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel before I saw the headlights sweep across the foyer. For a moment, I just stood there in the kitchen, gripping the sides of the counter, letting the silence hold me. The house was warm. Golden, even. The dining room glowed under the old chandelier Walter had surprised me with on our 20th anniversary. The crystal droplets shimmered like little suns. I'd laid out the lace table runner, the porcelain plates with the faint blue forget-me-nots, and polished the silver until I could see my face in the forks. Ellie breezed in first, heels clicking, her perfume settling into the air like it belonged there. Her hair was swept into a perfect twist, not a strand out of place. She greeted me with a bright smile and a brush of lips to my cheek that didn't quite touch skin. Behind her came my son, Henry. Sweet Henry, still boyish at 43, with that crooked smile that always made my heart ache a little. He held a bottle of wine in one hand and a pie tin in the other. "Smells incredible, Mom," he said, setting both on the counter. "I've been thinking about your pot roast all week." I thanked him, smiling, and wiped my hands on a dish towel that already held the scent of rosemary and thyme. Walter came in last, moving slower these days, though he'd never admit it. His shoulders were a little more stooped than last fall, but his shirt was pressed, his silver hair neatly combed. He kissed my temple, murmured a quiet hello, and disappeared into the dining room without another word. We sat, the four of us, around the same table where Henry once did his homework, where birthday candles had burned low into frosting, where decades of dinners had unfolded like chapters in a worn novel. The china clinked softly. Wine poured gently. And still, I felt it. A ripple beneath the stillness. Like the air just before a thunderstorm. Ellie sat across from me, a vision in cream satin and confidence. Her hands rested lightly on the table, her posture poised, her eyes too calm. She'd married Henry 3 years ago in a small chapel near the coast. She was 28 then, quick to smile, slow to reveal. Something about her had always made me tighten my jaw. "Claire, this roast," she said now, her voice smooth, almost admiring, "you must have been cooking all afternoon." I nodded. "Since 1. So much work," she added, tracing the rim of her glass. "You've always been so dedicated." There was something about the way she said that. Like the word hung in the air a beat too long. I felt Walter's silence at the head of the table like a shadow. Henry didn't notice. He never did. He was already digging in, humming with every bite, talking about some client who'd brought in a rescued dog and ended up adopting 3. He always had stories like that. Always finding the light, even when the rest of us were squinting. I watched Ellie from across the table. The way she smoothed her napkin. How she tilted her head when Henry spoke, laughing at the right places. It all looked effortless, but I knew better. Effortless women don't rehearse their smiles in the mirror. Walter didn't speak much. He cut his meat with careful attention, as if the plate in front of him demanded more than the rest of us. When he did glance up, it was toward Henry. Never toward me. I felt the first curl of unease then. Something small. Like a pinched nerve in the back of the neck. I told myself it was the wine. Or the long day. But I knew my body too well. I knew what tension felt like before it had a name. Halfway through the meal, Ellie shifted in her seat. Just slightly. Her hand drifted to her stomach in a way that seemed almost unconscious. A light touch, fingertips resting just below her ribcage. She wasn't smiling at Henry. She wasn't looking at anyone, really. Just down. But there was something in her expression. Something private and gleaming. The chandelier caught in her earrings. A single droplet of light slid along the edge of her jaw. She looked serene. Radiant, even. But it wasn't joy. It was something else. I watched her. And in that moment, I understood nothing, but I felt everything. The space between us felt hollow. The air heavier. Her gaze flicked upward, met mine for half a second, and then moved away. She's smiling, I thought. But not at anyone in this room. The flame of the candle between us flickered, catching in the curve of Ellie's green eyes. There was a sharpness to her look, like a glint off broken glass. She held my gaze for just a moment, long enough to feel it in my chest, then turned back to her wine with the grace of someone entirely at ease. But I wasn't. Henry was telling a story about a stubborn spaniel at the clinic. Something about a torn-up couch and a missing sock. He was laughing. Ellie laughed too, light and bright. But I noticed how her hands stayed on her belly. Not cradling, not protective. More like a reminder. As if she wanted us to look. I forced myself to eat, though the roast, so tender when I sliced it earlier, now felt like ash in my mouth. The potatoes were underseasoned. Or maybe it was just me. The wine tasted sharper than I remembered. Bitter along the edges. Walter stayed quiet. He'd always been a man of measured words, but this was different. His plate was mostly untouched. Every few minutes, he sipped his water. Not the wine I'd poured for him. He didn't say a word about the meal. Not even a polite thank you. Ellie noticed. I could tell. She was watching him when no one else was. So, Claire, she said, her voice smooth as silk, you've always been so good at hosting. Every detail. It's admirable. I looked up. Thank you. She smiled, tilting her head slightly. All those years of keeping a beautiful home. Raising a family. Supporting Walter's career. That kind of devotion is rare. The word hit the table like a coin dropped into a quiet room. Walter stiffened, just slightly. I felt it more than saw it. I nodded, pretending not to hear the emphasis. It was never about duty, I said. I liked building something that felt steady. Steady, she repeated, drawing the word out like a stretch of honey. That's the right word for it. There's a real power in that. Knowing the rhythms of a place. Of a person. Henry, oblivious, raised his glass. And there's power in knowing how to cook like Mom. Seriously, Elle, we should take notes. Ellie laughed, but her eyes stayed on me. Yes. We're lucky to have such a strong foundation to build on. The silence that followed wasn't long, but it felt like it was holding its breath. I looked to Walter, who was now inspecting the edge of his napkin like it held a secret. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. Not once since dinner began. Something was unraveling, and I could feel it even though I couldn't name it yet. Like a draft through a sealed window. You can't see it, but it brushes against the back of your neck. I've been reading about family legacies, Ellie said next, lifting her glass again. How traits and habits pass down without us realizing. I find it fascinating. Patterns that repeat. Her gaze shifted to Henry, softening as she reached for his hand. He smiled, squeezed back. Marriage is full of those little echoes, she added. Learning where you end and the other person begins. Or where the people before you never really ended at all. The chandelier light caught in her earrings again. Her voice was still light, but the edges were firm. She wasn't just making conversation. There was intent in every word. Henry looked proud, still convinced he'd married someone with a poet's heart. I studied Walter's profile instead. His jaw was tight. His lips pressed together in a way I hadn't seen since the winter his brother died. I tried to relax my shoulders, but they were stiff. My whole body was. There was a knot forming beneath my ribs. Ellie's compliments weren't compliments at all. They were questions in disguise. Warnings wrapped in ribbon. I'd spent most of my life reading between the lines. As a wife, a mother, a woman who'd walked into 100 rooms where something had already happened. I knew how to pick up the thread and follow it, even when no one said a word. And I knew something was off here. Deeply off. Ellie wasn't glowing with joy. She was beaming like someone who'd won. Marriage, she said again, this time more softly, isn't just about what you build. Sometimes, it's about what you share. Even if it was built before you got there. I blinked. The room was suddenly too warm. The fire crackled in the nearby hearth, but I could feel the heat rising in my neck for another reason entirely. Henry didn't seem to hear the shift. That's beautiful, he said, nodding. You always know how to say things just right. Ellie's smile turned toward him, but I wasn't watching her mouth anymore. I was watching her hand, drifting again to that flat stretch of her stomach. She held it there like a prize. Walter stood up suddenly. Anyone need more water? He asked, his voice too loud, too quick. I'll get it, I said, already rising. I needed the moment. The distance. In the kitchen, I gripped the sink and stared out the window. The backyard was dark now, the porch lights casting long shadows across the lawn. For years, I thought this house was where I knew everything. Every sound. Every pattern. But that night, I realized there were corners I'd stopped looking into. When I returned to the table, Ellie was the first to glance up. She looked calm. Settled. But I saw it then. A glint. Not joy. Not nerves. Something more pointed. Sharper. She reached for her fork and said, "The best marriages are the ones where nothing needs to be said aloud." That was when it happened. That flicker in my chest. Small, but sharp enough to notice. I didn't know what she meant. But I knew it wasn't innocent. Henry stood with the easy confidence he'd carried since he was a teenager. One hand held his wine glass high, the other rested lightly on Ellie's shoulder. "I just want to say how grateful I am," he began, his voice warm and full. "To be here with the people I love most in this world. To share this night. This meal. And this news." I paused mid-bite. The fork hovered near my mouth, but I didn't move. Something in his tone told me this was more than a thank you. Ellie lowered her eyes like a bride at the altar, then looked back up with a softness that seemed too rehearsed. Too perfect. "We're having a baby," she said. The words floated into the room like perfume. Light. Beautiful. Deadly. For a second, everything stopped. The fire in the hearth, the clink of silverware, even the air seemed to hold still. Then Henry let out a short, joyful laugh, and I watched him pull Ellie close. He kissed her temple with such tenderness that my chest ached. "A baby," he said again, grinning. "Can you believe it?" Walter looked down at his plate. His hands had stilled. The knife he'd been using to butter his bread rested in place, forgotten. I smiled. Or tried to. My face moved the right way, but nothing in it felt real. "Congratulations," I said softly. Ellie beamed. She placed both hands on her belly now, the gesture suddenly different. Not a hint anymore. A statement. Henry was already pouring more wine, offering a toast that landed somewhere far away from my ears. I nodded, lifted my glass when expected, but the taste of the wine was sharp and wrong. Like drinking vinegar through velvet. "She's 8 weeks, Henry said. "We just found out last week. She wanted to wait until tonight to share it." Ellie turned to him, her hand lightly brushing his. "You've been so excited, sweetheart." He kissed her again. I clapped with the rest of them. Even Walter managed a few stiff pats of his palms, though he never looked up. My hands felt numb. My heart had started pounding again, but not with joy. Something else. Something darker. Ellie rose from her chair. "I need a little stretch," she said, pressing a hand to the small of her back. "All this sitting is getting to me." She moved around the table, slow and graceful. I felt her coming before I saw her. My body tensed as she approached, and still, I didn't move. I kept smiling. When she leaned down beside me, it looked like any other hug. A gesture of affection between family. She even placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. Then her lips brushed my ear. "I'm carrying your husband's child," she whispered. Her breath was warm against my skin. Sweet with wine and something floral. The words hung there, weightless and heavy at once. My hand tightened around my fork. My spine stiffened. But I didn't turn. Instead, I laughed. Not loudly, not shrilly. Just enough to be heard. It rose from my throat like air escaping a cracked jar. I smiled. "Don't worry, dear," I said calmly. "Everything will be just fine." Ellie hesitated. I felt it. Her body stilled for a fraction of a second before she stood straight again. She returned to her seat beside Henry, who was still beaming. Still talking about names, cribs, and how he couldn't wait to teach his child how to fish. I watched her. Watched how she smoothed the skirt of her dress and lifted her glass. How she cast a quick glance across the table to Walter, who still hadn't spoken. His eyes were fixed on a spot in the tablecloth, as if he could disappear into it. The rest of the dinner passed in pieces. I don't remember what I said. Only that I said what was expected. I served pie. I complimented Ellie's shoes. I pretended to listen when Henry spoke about pediatricians and strollers. I touched Walter's arm once and felt him flinch. Later, as the front door closed and their car pulled out of the driveway, I stood in the foyer alone. The house was too quiet now. The kind of quiet that feels personal. Heavy. A silence that follows you from room to room. I walked back into the dining room and looked at the table. Plates with bits of crust. Glasses with melting ice. A smear of butter on the lace runner. It could have been any Sunday dinner. But something had ended. Or begun. She expected a scene. But I gave her something worse. Silence. The dishwasher hummed in the kitchen, a low mechanical rhythm behind the clink of glass and silver. I moved slowly, rinsing each plate before sliding it onto the rack. The water was too hot, but I let it burn. In the other room, the dining table was still set with the evidence of the evening. Crumpled napkins. A smear of gravy. A forgotten wine glass with a red crescent left behind. It looked ordinary, the aftermath of any family meal. But something inside me had shifted. Walter stood behind me for a moment, just beyond the archway. I could feel him there. Not moving. Watching. The way the air changes when someone walks into a room. I didn't turn around. "Claire," he said, his voice quiet. I opened the silverware drawer and reached for a spoon. The clatter inside was sharper than it needed to be. "I can explain," he tried again. I picked up a dish towel and dried my hands, staring out the window above the sink. The yard was dark now. The garden lights hadn't been turned on. The roses near the edge of the fence were nothing more than shadows. "Not tonight," I said. "I can't do this tonight." He didn't argue. Just stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked away. I heard the stairs creak under his weight. The soft hush of the bedroom door opening, then closing again. I stayed in the kitchen until the dishwasher beeped, its cycle complete. Then I dried each plate, each fork, each glass. I folded the napkins. Scraped the last crumbs into the trash. I wiped down the counters. Swept the floor. Polished the stove. The house had that strange kind of silence it gets after company leaves. A hush too perfect. It made me feel like I was living inside a snow globe. Still. Sealed. When I finally climbed the stairs, my legs felt heavier than they should have. I passed the hallway mirror and caught my reflection by accident. My face looked strange. As if some part of me had gone missing. Walter was already in bed, turned to his side, blanket pulled up beneath his chin. I stood at the door for a moment, unsure what to do with my body. Then I crossed the room, changed into my nightgown, and slid beneath the sheets without a sound. The bed creaked softly beneath my weight. I lay there, eyes open in the dark, staring at the ceiling fan. It spun slowly, the faintest click each time it rotated. I counted the clicks. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. A branch tapped the window, over and over. Somewhere in the attic, something shifted. Every sound was louder now. Or maybe I was just listening differently. Walter's breathing was steady beside me. Familiar. After 43 years, I knew the shape of his sleep. I'd spent decades curled into that rhythm. A comfort. A habit. But tonight, it felt like a wall. I turned to my side, facing the edge of the bed. My hand found the blanket seam. My fingers traced it again and again. I kept thinking about Ellie's voice. The way she said it. Like it was a gift. "I'm carrying your husband's child." She had whispered it so softly. As if she didn't want to wake something. And I had smiled. What else could I have done? If I'd cried, she would have won. If I'd screamed, Henry would have come running. If I'd said anything at all, I might have broken in half. So I gave her calm. I gave her nothing. And in that moment, it felt like the only power I had left. But now, in the dark, I felt all the pieces I'd been holding start to slip. What if it was true? What if Walter, the man I'd shared a bed and a life with, had been looking past me for longer than I realized? What if everything we built was only standing because I'd been the one holding the beams? I rolled onto my back, staring into the dark. The ceiling fan clicked on. Off. On. Off. Walter shifted beside me and let out a small snore. That sound, so normal, so part of my life, made something in my chest tighten. It was too loud. Too casual. It didn't belong in this night. I turned away from him again. Pulled the blanket up to my chin. I didn't know this bed could feel so wide. The sun was already high when I finally came down to the kitchen. I hadn't slept, not really. Just drifted in and out of dreams that felt like unfinished conversations. The air was cool. I opened the windows to let the breeze in and turned on the kettle. The kitchen looked the same as it always had. Pale yellow curtains, the old ceramic cookie jar shaped like a hen, the scuffed wood floors that still creaked in certain places. But everything felt altered. Tilted. I cracked 2 eggs into the frying pan, watched the white spread and bubble. The scent of butter and salt rose up, familiar, steady. I didn't feel hungry, but I needed something to do. I reached for the bread, then stopped. For 43 years, I had cut Walter's toast diagonally. Just the way he liked it. Without even thinking. I stared at the knife in my hand. The kettle whistled. I moved through the motions. Buttered the toast. Flipped the eggs. Set the table. 2 plates. 2 cups. Like always. He came down just as I was pouring the tea. "Morning," he said, not quite looking at me. I nodded. "Sleep well?" He Saturday, fine. We didn't speak after that. Just the scrape of forks. The tick of the clock on the wall. The birds outside making their usual fuss. But my mind wasn't in the room. It was pulling apart memories like threads from an old sweater. 3 months ago, Walter had started showering at odd times. Not just mornings. Sometimes after dinner. Sometimes after gardening. He'd say he didn't want to track in dirt or fertilizer. I believed him. 2 months ago, I found a credit card bill tucked behind a book in the study. Unfamiliar charges. A florist in neighboring Spring Hill. A jewelry store I'd never heard of. He said he was planning a surprise for our anniversary. Which was 5 months away. 6 weeks ago, Ellie started coming by on her own. Said she wanted to learn our family recipes. Learn how I seasoned my roast, how I kneaded the dough for my dinner rolls. She'd stay for hours, even when Henry wasn't home. Always smiling. Always listening. She and Walter had started having quiet conversations by the garden. I'd walk in, and they'd both stop talking. Said they were discussing the roses. Said she wanted to learn how to prune them properly. But she had once told me that dirt under her nails made her feel like an animal. All those little things I brushed aside. Excused. Explained. Now they rushed back like a flood. Every detail fitting together with painful clarity. I pushed my plate away, unable to take another bite. Walter said nothing. Just sipped his tea like it was any other Tuesday morning. I cleaned the table in silence. Washed the plates. Dried them. Put everything back in its place. My hands moved like they always had. But my heart beat like I'd just run up a hill. The phone rang. I jumped. "Hello? Mom?" Henry's voice. Bright. Untroubled. "Did you sleep last night?" I couldn't stop thinking about the baby. I'm still a little shocked. I swallowed. "It's wonderful news, sweetheart. She's already looking at nursery themes. Pastels. Maybe woodland animals. Oh, and she mentioned something. That Dad seemed really happy when she told him. Got a little emotional, even. My hand tightened on the receiver. She told your father?" "Yeah. Said she was nervous about how we'd react. Thought maybe you'd think we were too young, or not ready. So she told him last week." The words echoed. Last week. A full 7 days before she stood in our dining room, pretending to share the news with all of us at once. A full week of secret smiles. Of private glances. Henry kept talking. Something about names. About baby books. But I was no longer listening. I stared out the window. At the garden Walter had planted. The one he said he needed to tend before the first frost. He was out there now, kneeling by the roses, clippers in hand. He looked like any other man preparing his yard for winter. She told him first. Before our son. Before me. The clouds had rolled in by mid-afternoon, soft and low, turning the sky the color of dishwater. It was the kind of gray that made the whole house feel quiet, like it was holding its breath. I stood in the kitchen with a dish towel in one hand and a glass in the other, the window open just enough to let in the scent of earth and damp leaves. Walter was in the garden. I watched him through the lace curtain, bent low over the roses, trimming with the slow care of someone who needed something to focus on. He always said the roses needed attention before the first frost. As if that single sentence could explain hours of pruning and solitude. He wore his old corduroy jacket. The one I had mended twice. His movements were steady, but I knew them too well not to notice the tension in his shoulders. I dried the glass and set it in the rack. Reached for another. Rinsed. Wiped. Watched. Then I heard it. Tires on gravel. I leaned slightly toward the window, just enough to see the silver car pulling into the drive. Ellie. She stepped out slowly, her blonde hair pulled back tight, a wool coat wrapped around her waist. No makeup today. Just a touch of color in her cheeks from the cold. She didn't look at the house. She walked straight to the garden. Straight to Walter. I held my breath. He looked up as she approached. Something passed between them that I couldn't name. Not tenderness, not quite. But familiarity. A kind of ease that stopped me cold. She said something I couldn't hear. He laughed. Actually laughed. Not the stiff chuckle he'd been giving me. A real laugh. I saw the lines around his eyes deepen. He reached up to adjust his glasses, and she touched his sleeve. Lightly. Her fingers just brushing the fabric near his elbow. My stomach turned. He answered her, and she tilted her head, smiling. She leaned in closer. Too close. I set the towel down, slowly, carefully, like I was handling glass. They talked for a while. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe more. I lost track. She pointed toward the roses. He followed her gesture, nodding. She laughed again, tossed her head back the way young women do when they want to seem carefree. I didn't move. I couldn't. Finally, she touched his arm one last time. Then she turned and walked back to her car. He stood there a moment longer, watching her leave. When the car disappeared around the bend, he went back to his roses. But his posture had changed. He moved differently now. Lighter somehow. Unburdened. I stepped back from the window. The towel had fallen to the floor. That evening, he came in humming. Humming. Set his boots by the door, came to the table with hands still smelling faintly of soil. He talked through dinner. Not much, but more than I'd heard in weeks. He mentioned the shape of the rose beds, the way the soil had held more moisture than expected. He even told a small story about a squirrel stealing one of the bulbs he had set out for the tulips. I nodded. Listened. Responded where needed. But inside, I was watching that garden all over again. She's not afraid of being seen with him. She wants me to watch. The clouds had rolled in by mid-afternoon, soft and low, turning the sky the color of dishwater. It was the kind of gray that made the whole house feel quiet, like it was holding its breath. I stood in the kitchen with a dish towel in one hand and a glass in the other, the window open just enough to let in the scent of earth and damp leaves. Walter was in the garden. I watched him through the lace curtain, bent low over the roses, trimming with the slow care of someone who needed something to focus on. He always said the roses needed attention before the first frost. As if that single sentence could explain hours of pruning and solitude. He wore his old corduroy jacket. The one I had mended twice. His movements were steady, but I knew them too well not to notice the tension in his shoulders. I dried the glass and set it in the rack. Reached for another. Rinsed. Wiped. Watched. Then I heard it. Tires on gravel. I leaned slightly toward the window, just enough to see the silver car pulling into the drive. Ellie. She stepped out slowly, her blonde hair pulled back tight, a wool coat wrapped around her waist. No makeup today. Just a touch of color in her cheeks from the cold. She didn't look at the house. She walked straight to the garden. Straight to Walter. I held my breath. He looked up as she approached. Something passed between them that I couldn't name. Not tenderness, not quite. But familiarity. A kind of ease that stopped me cold. She said something I couldn't hear. He laughed. Actually laughed. Not the stiff chuckle he'd been giving me. A real laugh. I saw the lines around his eyes deepen. He reached up to adjust his glasses, and she touched his sleeve. Lightly. Her fingers just brushing the fabric near his elbow. My stomach turned. He answered her, and she tilted her head, smiling. She leaned in closer. Too close. I set the towel down, slowly, carefully, like I was handling glass. They talked for a while. Maybe 10 minutes. Maybe more. I lost track. She pointed toward the roses. He followed her gesture, nodding. She laughed again, tossed her head back the way young women do when they want to seem carefree. I didn't move. I couldn't. Finally, she touched his arm one last time. Then she turned and walked back to her car. He stood there a moment longer, watching her leave. When the car disappeared around the bend, he went back to his roses. But his posture had changed. He moved differently now. Lighter somehow. Unburdened. I stepped back from the window. The towel had fallen to the floor. That evening, he came in humming. Humming. Set his boots by the door, came to the table with hands still smelling faintly of soil. He talked through dinner. Not much, but more than I'd heard in weeks. He mentioned the shape of the rose beds, the way the soil had held more moisture than expected. He even told a small story about a squirrel stealing one of the bulbs he had set out for the tulips. I nodded. Listened. Responded where needed. But inside, I was watching that garden all over again. She's not afraid of being seen with him. She wants me to watch. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees when I saw her again. That silver car of hers glided into the drive like it had every right to be there. I was at the kitchen sink, rinsing lettuce leaves, the window cracked open to let in the fading warmth of late autumn. The sky had turned the color of rusted copper, casting long orange streaks across the countertops. Ellie stepped out in fitted jeans and a soft green sweater that clung to her figure. Her hair was pulled back, not severe, but intentional. One hand clutched her purse. The other adjusted her coat. She didn't glance at the house. She headed straight for the garden. Walter was already out there, kneeling near the tool shed, his hands deep in the soil. But it wasn't him she approached. It was Marcus. He stood by the compost bin, rake in hand, the tail end of the day's work still clinging to his boots. He straightened when he saw her. Said something I couldn't hear. She stepped in close. Too close for the tone on his face. I dried my hands and moved toward the window, slow and silent. The curtain hid me well. I could see them but they couldn't see me. They spoke quietly. His body stiff. Hers fluid. At one point, she reached into her purse and pulled something out. An envelope. Thick. Cream-colored. She handed it to him with a softness that didn't match the tension in his face. Marcus hesitated. Looked around. Then took it. He didn't smile. He didn't thank her. Just slid it into his jacket pocket like it was something shameful. Ellie leaned in, said something else. He shook his head. She touched his arm, and for a moment I thought he might drop the rake altogether. But he didn't. She turned and walked away without another word, her boots leaving no sound on the stone path. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open. I had moved to the stove by then, pretending to stir a pot that wasn't even on. The smell of lemon and vinegar still clung to the air from where I'd wiped the counters. Claire. Her voice rang out like a melody she didn't mean. Just me. Hope that's all right. I wiped my hands again. Of course. Henry arrived not long after. I watched through the window as he parked, smiling when he spotted Ellie waiting in the entryway. He kissed her, spun her once like they were teenagers. "What were you doing here?" he asked, grinning. "Oh, I just wanted to ask Marcus something about winter plants," she said smoothly. "Thought I'd surprise you." She tucked herself under his arm like she belonged there. They came in for lunch, and I had already laid out soup and sandwiches. Nothing fancy. Just enough. Henry filled the air with chatter. Baby names. Crib styles. Something about a parenting book one of his friends had recommended. Ellie was quieter than usual. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Every few moments, her gaze drifted toward the window. Toward the garden. I watched her when she wasn't looking. The slight furrow in her brow. The way she pressed her lips together after each sip of water. She was somewhere else in her mind. And it wasn't the baby she was thinking about. She glanced at me once. Just once. But it was long enough. Our eyes locked. There it was again. That same glint. Not fear. Not apology. Challenge. As if to say, "What will you do now?" I held her gaze. Let mine settle into something older. Something quieter. Something she hadn't earned the right to understand. She looked away first. Henry didn't notice. He kept talking. Kept smiling. Kept believing. She thinks I'll stay quiet. She doesn't know who raised me. The rain had started slow that evening, soft as fingers tapping on the patio stones. It had been coming all day, heavy in the clouds, pushing the light out of the sky until the whole yard looked dim and bruised. I stood at the edge of the kitchen, staring through the sliding glass door. Water pooled near the shed, streaking down the windows in lazy trails. I had just turned off the stove when I saw movement near the garden. 3 figures. At first, they were only shapes, blurred by the rain and the twilight. But then one turned slightly, and I saw Ellie's profile. Sharp. Unapologetic. Her arms were crossed tight against her chest, but her mouth was moving fast. Marcus stood to her left. He looked wet and miserable. His jacket clung to him, shoulders slumped. Walter was just behind them both, hands in his pockets, his face turned toward the ground. I opened the door without thinking. The rain hit me in a rush. Cold. Clean. It soaked through the shoulders of my sweater in seconds, but I kept walking, barefoot on the wet stone, until I was close enough to hear. I can't keep doing this, Marcus was saying, his voice low and tired. This isn't right. You agreed, Ellie snapped. You knew what this was. I didn't know everything, he said. I didn't know what you were planning to do with it. With him. With her. He glanced toward Walter. Don't look at him like that, Ellie said. He knew. He agreed too. We all did what we had to do. Walter finally raised his head. His eyes met mine for half a second before sliding away again. Bess, he said quietly, you shouldn't be out here. In my own yard? I asked. Nobody answered. I stepped closer, water sloshing beneath my feet. What's going on? I asked. What have you agreed to? Ellie let out a slow breath. Claire, this really isn't the time. No, Marcus interrupted. She deserves to know. Ellie's mouth dropped open. Marcus. No, he said again, louder. I can't keep lying for you. For either of you. He looked at me. Henry's in trouble, he said. Big trouble. Gambling. Online stuff. Sports bets. It started small, but it got out of control. He's over 100,000 in debt. The rain kept falling. I barely felt it anymore. He told Ellie, Marcus went on. He was panicking. Didn't know what to do. She said she'd help. Said she could fix it. Ellie's eyes were blazing now. Don't you dare. She helped him get loans, Marcus said. Credit cards. Lines of credit. All in his name. Told him it would be fine. That no one would find out. I turned to Walter. He was soaked. His glasses fogged. His lips pressed thin. You knew, I said. He nodded. He came to me. Begged me not to tell you. Said he'd fix it. But he didn't. And when Ellie found out, she made a deal. She threatened him, Marcus said. Said if he didn't cooperate, she'd ruin him. Said she'd tell you everything, tell everyone. Said she'd lie if she had to. I looked at Ellie. She didn't flinch. What did she ask for? I asked. Walter swallowed hard. She told me to let people think we were involved, he said. That the baby was mine. So she could control the story. Keep Henry protected. Keep you quiet. The baby isn't his? I asked, staring at her now. Ellie didn't speak. Marcus did. It's mine, he said, barely audible. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for any of it. I didn't know what she was doing until it was too late. Ellie's silence said everything. I felt the ground sway. All that time. All those smiles. That toast at dinner. The way she touched her belly like it was a secret treasure. She had been lying. To all of us. To Henry. To me. I didn't move. I didn't cry. Walter looked at me like a man waiting to be sentenced. Marcus looked like he was breaking right in front of us. And Ellie stood in the rain like she had nothing left to lose. I should have screamed. Instead, I stood very still. The faucet in the guest bathroom had been dripping all morning. Just a soft plink every few seconds. I could hear it from the hallway, echoing against the tile like time ticking too loud in a quiet house. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cool and faintly floral. Ellie always left a trace of her behind. Her perfume, her lotion, her expensive little touches. There was a folded towel resting neatly on the rack, and a magazine left open on the counter to a page about nursery wall stencils. The window was cracked. A breeze stirred the curtains just enough to move them. I turned off the faucet, twisted it tight. But I stayed there longer than I needed to, standing in the pale morning light, staring at the ordinary things that no longer felt ordinary. I bent down to pick up a hairpin on the floor, and that was when I saw it. Tucked behind the base of the toilet, half hidden against the tile, was an envelope. White. Thin. Slightly crumpled at the corner. The kind that gets wedged into places by accident or intention. My fingers didn't hesitate. The flap was already loose. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Folded once. Crisp. Clean. Gene Tech Laboratories. That was the letterhead. I recognized it immediately. A private testing company from the next county. Henry had once used it for allergy screening. But this wasn't an allergy report. It was a paternity test. I sank down onto the closed toilet seat and unfolded the page with care, my hands moving slower than they needed to. My eyes scanned the rows of clinical language, each line colder than the one before. Mother, Ellie Holloway. Alleged father 1, Henry Holloway. Probability of paternity, 0%. Alleged father 2, Marcus Ruiz. Probability of paternity, 99.7%. The numbers floated in front of me. Cold. Final. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I just read it twice. Then a third time. Making sure I hadn't misunderstood. There it was. The truth. The child Ellie was carrying was not Henry's. Not Walter's either, though she had let me believe that lie for weeks. It was Marcus's. The gardener. The man she had paid. The man who had looked at me with such guilt in the rain. I stared down at the paper. A single page that held enough weight to collapse a family. She hadn't lost it. Not by accident. Ellie didn't lose things. She placed them. And this paper, this proof, it wasn't for Henry. It wasn't for Marcus. It was for her. A safety net. A weapon. A guarantee that if everything unraveled, she could shift the story once more. Cry manipulation. Accuse Walter. Claim she'd been coerced, that she was a victim. She could hold this test up like a flag and march out of the wreckage untouched. She had covered every angle. I folded the paper again, carefully this time. Smoothed it flat. Then I tucked it into the inside pocket of my cardigan. My hands trembled as I stood. I looked in the mirror. My own reflection stared back at me, older and unfamiliar. There was a knock at the door. Claire. Ellie's voice. I think I might have left something in there. Did you see anything? I opened the door slowly. Nothing, I said, stepping past her. She tilted her head, studying my face like she always did. Looking for a slip. A crack. Thank you, she said sweetly. I nodded. Walked away. My hand rested over the pocket. The folded edge of the envelope pressed gently against my palm. She left it behind. But I won't. The table gleamed in the candlelight. I had polished the crystal myself that morning, rinsed every glass until it shone like water held in place. The silver was laid out with care, and the napkins were folded into neat fans, tucked just beside the china. The room smelled of rosemary and lemon. A roast was warming in the oven, and a soft piano record played in the background. The chandelier cast its usual golden glow over everything, but tonight, the light felt more theatrical than warm. Walter stood in the doorway watching me as I adjusted a fork ever so slightly. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know." "Then why?" I looked up at him. "Because this house has seen every lie told in it," I said. "It's time it heard the truth." He didn't argue. Just nodded once and left me to finish. They arrived right on time. Henry in his dark blue sweater, the one Ellie always said brought out his eyes. He carried a bottle of wine. Ellie followed behind him, perfectly made up, one hand resting lightly over her stomach. She smiled when she stepped into the room, but her eyes swept the table like a scout checking terrain. "It's beautiful, Claire," she said. "Thank you." Dinner began like any other. Small talk. Polite laughter. Henry complimented the food twice before the salad course was done. Ellie joined in with practiced ease, every sentence placed just right. But I watched her hands. They were tighter than usual, fingers curling slightly around her fork. Walter stayed mostly quiet. His eyes were on his plate. I waited until the dessert was finished. Until the plates had been cleared. I poured the coffee. Then I brought out the envelope. I set it in the center of the table. Henry looked up. "What's this?" I sat down slowly. "Something I found in the guest bathroom." Ellie froze. Henry reached for it, fingers brushing the paper lightly as if expecting it to burn. He opened it. Unfolded the page. Read it once. Then again. I watched the change happen in him. The way his face fell, quietly and completely. As if someone had pulled a string loose behind his eyes. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie didn't speak. He read the line aloud. "Probability of paternity, 0%. Then he looked at her. "Tell me this isn't real." She didn't answer. Walter shifted beside me. I turned to him. "Now," I said. He looked up. Met Henry's eyes. "I knew," he said. "I knew the child wasn't yours. Ellie told me. She said she would protect you if I played along. I didn't want you to lose everything. I thought I could contain it. Keep it from spreading." Henry blinked. "So you lied," he said. "You both lied. You let me believe." "I was trying to protect you," Walter said quietly. Ellie's chair scraped the floor. "You don't understand." "No," Henry cut in, voice rising. "I really don't. You stood in this house. Sat at this table. And let me think I was going to be a father." She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "I loved you," he said. "I believed you." The room had gone so quiet that even the clock on the wall felt loud. "I gave up everything for you," he said, his voice cracking now. "And you were never even mine." Ellie's face changed then. Not anger. Not fear. Something closer to resignation. She stood. Straightened her blouse. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. Henry didn't look at her again. She turned and walked toward the door. Each step steady. Slow. Measured. I rose and followed her to the front hall. She picked up her coat, slipped it over her shoulders with trembling hands. At the threshold, she paused. Her eyes found mine one last time. I didn't say a word. She didn't speak again. She just packed her things. By the time the roses bloomed again, the worst of it had already passed. The frost had lifted, the yard had softened, and Walter was back in the garden with his quiet hands and his trimmed clippers, tending to each stem as if nothing had happened. But of course, everything had. He no longer hummed while he worked. There was no music in his movements, only rhythm. No words passed between us as I brought him his tea each morning, but he always drank it. Always gave me that slight nod when I set it on the ledge near the bench. It was enough. Henry stayed for a while. Slept in his old room upstairs with the window open and his shoes by the radiator like he used to. He didn't say much those first few weeks. Just followed me into the kitchen, peeled carrots when asked, stirred pots in silence. But one morning I found him reading the paper at the table, his coffee half gone. He was humming, soft and slow, and I knew then he was beginning to come back to himself. He started attending meetings. Drove twice a week to a little church basement 2 towns over. Sometimes he came home quieter. Other days, he looked tired but clearer. I didn't press. Recovery, I've learned, is something you walk toward, not through. The envelope came in early June. Pale blue. No return address. Just his name, written in her delicate script. I watched him open it in the living room. The air smelled like lavender from the open window, and the dog was asleep at our feet. Walter had gone out for mulch. Inside was a single photo. The baby. Dark eyes. Full cheeks. A little fist curled near his mouth. Henry held it a long time. Then passed it to me. I studied the child's face. There was something in his gaze. Something old. He looked nothing like Henry. But I didn't say that. There was a note, short and plain. He's healthy. I thought you should know. No signature. No apology. Henry folded it back into the envelope, then set it on the mantel. He never moved it again. It stayed there all summer, untouched but not forgotten. By autumn, he met someone new. Her name was Elise. She worked at the local library and wore her hair in a long braid down her back. She was quiet in a different way. Not because she was hiding anything, but because she didn't need to fill the silence. When he brought her to dinner, I watched the way they moved together. No rehearsed smiles. No careful stories. Just ease. They married the following spring. A small ceremony. Just family. No lace, no lies. A year later, Elise gave birth to a little girl with Henry's eyes and Elise's dimpled chin. They named her June. When I held her in my arms for the first time, she blinked up at me with such steady calm I forgot how to speak. Her skin was warm against my chest, her breath soft and sweet. She smelled like powder and milk and something holy. Walter stood beside me, watching. He didn't smile. But his hands settled gently on my shoulder and stayed there. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, I sit in the garden near the roses. The ones he saved from frost and wind and too many careless hands. They bloom heavier now. Whiter. As if they know what we buried in this soil and what we chose to keep alive. I think about Ellie from time to time. Wonder where she went. What name she gave the baby. Whether she ever looks back. But I don't miss her. I remember her voice. Her perfume. The way she looked at me that night with a smile full of war. And I remember the quiet after. The days that came next. The peace I chose instead of revenge. The truth I spoke even when my voice trembled. The strength it took to hold still and not shatter. She didn't destroy us. I didn't let her.